In this video, I'm going to walk you through how to paint a bright, realistic, and beautiful looking sky like the one I've been working on in my recent oil painting. So to get started, let's jump back all the way to when I begin this 30 by 40 inch landscape. At the beginning of every piece that I do, it's important to me to tone the canvas with a little burnt sienna, and then through washes of thinned down burnt sienna, no medium, I scrub in the shadows and then try to reveal some of the light areas and establish a good overall composition. Once that composition is established, I'll go to my palette and start mixing colors. I'm using Gamblin Artist Oils with some liquid impasto medium and a little bit of thinner as well. I don't want my paints to be too thick. I want them to flow very nicely, especially at the beginning of this process. The colors I'm using are burnt sienna, ultramarine blue, phthalo blue-green shade, titanium white, quinacridone magenta, cad orange, and some Indian yellow, which I occasionally use from time to time. I mix some darker blues all the way to some lighter blues, and this will be the color of the bright blue and smoothly transitioned sky up in the left portion of the painting. I like to use the darkest color first and apply that to the canvas. I'm not worried about blending just yet. I want to get all of the colors established. Now this is why I particularly like to use oils, especially when I'm tackling something this difficult. To get these nice smooth transitions, it's very, very hard. And so I'll do my best with a smaller brush like this Dagger Striper to establish a pretty good gradient from dark to light. Then I'll use this fan brush to start to blend it out. And I'll repeat this process a lot, as you'll see moving forward. The goal here in the beginning is to get as much of the canvas covered for the portion that I'm working on, and trying to get the colors in each given area to be as accurate as they can be. I don't go throughout the entire sky because this 30 by 40 inch canvas can be intimidating. So I try to chunk it off into pieces. And I decide to divide the painting into the clouds to the right and the blue sky to the left. I'll work on the blue sky for now, and then once I feel comfortable with that, I'll move to the clouds. This allows me to really work this area to perfection, at least as much as I can, before moving on, which helps me overall in the end with not only being efficient with my time, but I think it helps with the quality of my work as well. Working with wet paint can really be helpful, and again, it's why I like to use oils for things like this, because it allows you to really work it and take your time until you feel like you've done the best job you can, and then you can move on to the next portion of the painting. So you can see I apply a lot of the paint initially with a smaller brush and then use something like this fan brush to blend it out. Now that I've got a good idea established and a nice smooth gradient on the left side of the painting where the blue sky is, now I can start thinking about those clouds to the right. So I kind of use the same colors and I mix just some darker shades, some dark blue, medium blue. They're not very saturated, they have a lot of gray in them. So I'll start again with usually the darkest colors, and I'll start thinking about where those dark colors should exist. And I try to block in those colors and then fill in the areas in and around those with the next tone. And that's a little bit of a lighter blue. This is going to allow me to provide depth in my clouds, allows you to sort of visualize and imagine that light just being able to peek through some of these darker areas, these big clouds. And again, I'm not focused on making sure everything is nice and smooth and the way I want it to look in the end. I'm focused on getting the colors as accurate as I can. And I try to blend and keep my brush strokes direction in the right direction as much as I can overall to try and get myself as close to the finish line as possible. So after I've got some of the dark colors established, I move towards the lighter colors. And I try to tie it in a little bit with the blue that I finished on the left. That blue on the left is still a little bit tacky. I had finished it the evening prior, and so I'll try to tie that in together. It still blends together to some degree, but not much. And this is why I like to divide especially when it comes to larger works, my canvas into different portions, because to try and tackle this entire sky in one go is difficult, especially in the beginning. So I try to block in some of those orange colors where I know the highlights of the clouds are going to be. I try to blend that into the blues, but the problem with creating bright, beautiful skies like this is oftentimes you have bright orange and yellows, and you're trying to blend those into darker blues. The problem with that is in the middle, it can become green. So this is a heavy challenge on myself every time I approach a sky like this. So what I do, and what you can kind of see, is on a smaller scale, I divide the clouds up into sections. So I have the areas that are orange and red and yellow and the areas that are blue, and I don't do a lot of blending in between. You can use some gray to try and blend those two together, but again, it's very difficult. So I do my best, and the result is adequate, but you don't see a lot of blending. So it's beautiful. You can see what I'm trying to accomplish, but I'm not worried about blending all of that out yet. So as long as the composition looks good to me, as long as the colors look good to me, I know that with a second layer of paint, I can get myself to the finish line where I want the painting to be in the end. So when it comes to showing light, like a bright light where the sun actually exists, I use a lot of cad yellow, and I like to use some bright cad orange as well, and then simply titanium white. And in the beginning here, I'm not worried about keeping the sun as white as possible. I'm worried about establishing those bright gradients of yellow and orange around the sun and around my source of light. A lot of this is going to come into play once I get towards the finish and I add the actual white to where the sun's going to be. So it's important for me to not establish the brightness of the light quite yet, but rather establish the appropriate color around the sun and around the area, because the key with creating a bright light source is not the light source itself, it's how the light interacts with the things around it. And so the clouds and the sky that are leading up to where the sun is going to be, that surrounding area, that's what's important. And it's important for things to get brighter as you get closer to the sun. But then it's also important to have an object that contrasts the light, and that allows you to see how bright the light is. So I like this cloud that's down low on the left, right on the horizon, because it contrasts that sun very well, and I can put some nice bright oranges and reds in that cloud, which really amplifies the feeling of that light source, that sunlight. Now that I've got the sky overall, I've kind of finished the rest of the painting, which I'll talk about in a future video. I'm ready to do the second layer of paint. So now is where the magic happens. So I go back into the bright blue sky up above, and I basically mix the same colors. I apply those same colors, and you can see that I'm not worried about blending just yet. I just want those colors to be represented on the canvas. And then once all those colors are applied to the sky, I go in with my fan brushes and I start to blend it out. With the underlying paint being pretty accurate, this is actually quite easy for me at this point, because that first layer of paint really makes things easy for me to blend over the top. So I usually use a couple different dry fan brushes to blend this out. And once that's established, before it dries, I start thinking about some of the details that I want in the sky. So I go right into some of these light fluffy clouds that I want kind of drifting up into the blue here. So I add some white, a little bit of orange, and I start to apply this paint right into the work that I just did. So all of this is wet. This is the second layer of paint, and you can see I fanned out some lighter areas, and now I'm going back into those areas and getting more aggressive and actually revealing the clouds. So as I go, I like to use this dagger striper brush, sometimes a fan brush or something softer to blend it out with, but you can blend fairly well with some of these small brushes. And I just try to apply some bright spots of paint, and then I just kind of fan it out, blend it out. So the bright blue sky is starting to look good now, and the paint's still wet, but now I'm ready and feeling comfortable to tackle the clouds again. So I go back in to the clouds and I start this time with the highlights. So once I'm looking to really finalize something like clouds, these bright areas, and when I'm facing a difficult type of blend, oranges to blues, like I was saying earlier, I like to start with those oranges and lighter, brighter tones, because if you start with the blues and the darker colors, that's where it can start messing you up and you can get a lot of muddiness, can start to turn green. So I usually start with the bright. Once I'm into the final layer, I usually start in the opposite direction, starting with the very brightest colors. So I get those highlights established, and then I start working my way into some grays and some warmer tones that represent some, in between shadows. I don't want to get into the dark blues yet, but I want to start to transition my way to those blues. So I like to use some warm grays or even just some very neutral grays, and that helps me bridge the gap between the blues and the yellows. So as I go here, there's all sorts of little tedious things that I'm paying attention to. I'm trying to blend out the leading edge of this cloud. I want it to really be in harmony with that blue turquoise sky behind, so I try to blend certain areas. I want to leave some hard edges in other areas. So there's just a lot of little just personal nitpicking, and a lot of this is personal. But once I feel pretty good about that, I go right into the dark areas of the clouds again. And you can see as I get close to these bright oranges and these reds, you can see the warmth in those darker tones. So I'm using more neutral grays rather than blue grays. And that, again, helps me blend the reds into the blues. So I'm trying to, in the same way that I did the bright blue and smooth sky to the left, I'm trying to get the canvas completely covered with colors that I feel like are accurate to those specific spots. And once I have all the colors and all of the clouds covered in paint, then I start to go in with some more softer brushes and I start to fan some of these colors out and I start to blend out some of these areas. And so as I blend them out, it starts to provide a little more realism to these clouds. And then after I do that, I can start thinking about some of the harder edges and some of the thicker paint that I want to exist. So I try to blend, and then I try to add some of those hard lines because it's important to have hard edges in your clouds as well. It's not always going to be soft. If you really pay attention to clouds, there's usually a couple hard edges that exist throughout the composition. So now I'm really starting to blend all of my work that I just did. I'm trying to really create a flow, and I want that flow to be from the light and sweep into the shadows. And a lot of this is the idea of composition I had for this painting. But when I'm doing this, it's important to start to increase the intensity of the lighter colors. So now that you've got a lot of these blends, now at the leading edge of these blends is when I start adding more saturation to the colors I'm applying. So you can see I'm adding the brighter oranges, and I'm trying to emphasize those highlights. And that starts to take away attention from some of the transitions that you have, and it really starts to focus your eyes on the things that stand out in the clouds. And so you don't have to have perfect blends everywhere. I think you need to have more of a focal point and something that really pleases your eyes. And then the rest of the sky, the parts that maybe you weren't quite satisfied with some of the blending in certain areas, those start to just disappear, and the viewer really starts to focus in on the areas that are bright and the areas that pop out at you. So this is the time when I start to forget about those areas high up in the shadows, and I start to really focus most of my attention on the highlights. So after that second layer of paint is about dry, it has a little bit of tackiness left to it, I go back in to where the sun is going to be and I start adding pure white. Because it's a little bit tacky, it allows me to layer over the top a little bit. It still allows the paint to adhere to what's on the canvas, and I get away with just 2 layers rather than having to complete a 3rd layer. And now is when I'm thinking again about thicker paint. So I'm starting to apply some thicker orange, some thicker yellows, and I'm keeping that thicker paint specifically for and reserved for the brighter and more colorful spots in the sky. I think that really, again, brings the focus to those areas and is really when you start seeing it as a bright light. And working the landscape around the sun is also just as important. So if you have things like mountains or trees or a horizon line right next to the sun, it's important to brighten some of those up as well, because that helps you visualize how bright that light coming through really is. So now, just like the area around the sun, I'm going back into those clouds as that starts to dry and tack up, and I'm just finalizing a few more things, and particularly with the highlights. So I wanted there to be a little more pinks and reds, especially as you get further away from the sun. So I go back and start to mix, I want to say muted pinks and oranges, things that are a little more gray, not quite as punchy, and that'll help me blend into the blues and the shadows. So I start out by just softly adding some of these tones and then blending and fanning them out as best as I can. And then once that is established, I go in and brighten the highlights a step further. So now I've got some orange and white and a little bit of yellow, and I'm starting to make the brightest part of the highlights really pop even further. So in these last stages, I'm really just focused on adding texture to the canvas and emphasizing these highlights. And I get into this in a couple of seconds here at a further stage in the painting where I really add a third layer and more thick paint, but I'm just focused around the highlights. So at this point in time, it's all about the highlights. The shadows, even though maybe there might be some imperfections in those, they kind of melt away. And especially once I get the subjects in, I get the birds in the sky, all of that really starts to just kind of fade away into the background. But the highlights are what stands out. So I keep my focus on the highlights. I keep trying to improve the oranges and the yellows and the whites. And if I had one recommendation for a sky overall, it's to make sure that you focus most of your attention on the bright areas. Use some thicker paint when you get into those bright areas. And just take your time in general. Blending colors warms into cools. It's one of the most difficult things that I run into painting. And when you feel rushed, when you try to tackle the whole sky without a plan in place, which segment you're going to approach at what time, if you just go at it without a plan, that's when I find myself, at least, in a place where I think I've messed up. So to prevent myself from screwing up and going down a path that I'm not happy with, I like to have a very strict plan when I approach an intricate, bright, beautiful, colorful sky. So I hope that this video overall kind of just help explain a little bit how I approach this, and maybe you can find ways that this can apply in your own work. Here in the end, you can see me adding that thicker paint to really bring the focus not only on the highlights in the sky, but brings the focus to my subject matter, and that's these birds that are flying through. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope that you got something out of it. If you're interested in learning more, I post the real-time footage of all of my processes and my paintings to the members portion of my channel. So check out my YouTube memberships, either the blue join button or in the description down below. In the next video, I'll be going over some of the other portions of this painting, like the water, the mountains, and the birds themselves. So until then, thank you so much.